With the third integrated flight test on the horizon, SpaceX has kept the momentum going, pushing ahead to maximize efforts before Starship's next testing milestone. So settle in, get comfortable, and grab some popcorn, because we're about to delve into another exciting Starship update. Starting off this week, first thing on Friday morning, the fourth section of Booster 14's liquid oxygen tank was moved into Mega Bay 1 in preparation for continued stacking operations on this latest Super Heavy. Later that morning, a concrete pump truck set up for yet another pour for the foundations for the new office building under construction next to the Starfactory. Down at the launch site, a crane lifted a freshly modified ship lifting pin arm up to the top of the left chopstick for installation. We can see that the pin arm was cut in half and reconnected with an offset using an offset plate and cross bracing. This modification shifts the lifting point several inches towards the tower, likely to correct the alignment issues SpaceX has been having while stacking ships onto boosters. At the Starfactory, crews began installing cladding on the front wall of the massive building. Unlike the cladding on the rest of the building, this front wall looks like it will be black and comprised of smaller exterior panels. That afternoon, workers were observed removing some cladding on the bottom of Mega Bay 2. With the cladding removed, some of the underlying structure was also taken out, leaving a new opening while also giving us a peek into the right side of the building. Around that same time, a small vertical tank that had been laying around on the ground next to the flame deflector tank farm was lifted by a crane and placed onto a waiting SPMT. The concrete work at the office building site continued through the afternoon. With us well into our second straight week of extensive concrete placement at the site, it is clear that the building will have very substantial foundations. By mid-afternoon, the small tank and the crane that placed it on the SPMT moved out of the launch site and took a brief trip along Highway 4 before turning in at the D4 gate and heading to the back side of the orbital tank farm. A little over an hour later, up the road at the Sanchez site, a different smaller vertical tank was lifted by a crane for installation. Also, at the orbital tank farm, crews continue to work on the piping side of the upgrades. In front of the new horizontal tanks, another pipe section was lifted and installed on the new pipe stands as they endeavored to get the new storage tanks plumbed in. A short time after that, back at the orbital tank farm, the recently relocated tank was once again lifted by a crane. This time, the tank was moved and set down in the footprint of the tank farm's original vertical water tank that was scrapped in recent months. Later, the freshly modified ship lifting pin on the left arm of the chopsticks was actuated and raised to stick up in the air as crews looked to verify their adjusted hardware. About another 20 minutes later, the pin was actuated again, returning it to its previous position. That night, another section of Booster 14's liquid oxygen tank was rolled out of the Starfactory. This is the fifth and final section of the LOX tank, and it is likely to be the last section that is stacked for a while, as there is normally a significant pause before stacking of the aft sections begin. In the early hours of Saturday morning, the concrete pump truck was once again back at work at the office building as foundation work continued on through the morning. Meanwhile, iron workers keep making steady progress on the Starfactory expansion. Columns and roof beams continue to be placed at a steady pace as the front section of the building grows towards the office site. Shortly after noon, the stand for the 2-point ship lifter was moved into Mega Bay 2, where Ship 29 was still connected to one of the building's bridge cranes via one of the lifting jigs. Down at the launch site, Ship 28's flaps were deployed on Test Stand B as the vehicle prepared for a fresh round of engine testing. Later that afternoon, another vertical tank was rolled out of the launch site's D2 gate and made its way down to D4 gate at the orbital tank farm. Up the road inside of Mega Bay 2, the 2-point lifter was detached from Ship 29. The bridge crane then moved the lifter over to the recently delivered stand and set it down before being disconnected. Barely an hour after being detached from the 2-point lifter, the bridge detachment was likely just to check and adjust the lifting slings. Late in the afternoon, 2 more tanks were delivered to the launch site as SpaceX continues to redesign the orbital tank farm. That night, the 2-point lifter in Mega Bay 2 was lifted back off of the stand and reattached to Ship 29. Then in the early hours of Sunday morning, Ship 29 was lifted off of the work stand and transferred to a waiting ship transport stand. By mid-morning, the ship was once again disconnected from the 2-point lifter. Less than an hour after being disconnected from the crane, Ship 29 rolled out of Mega Bay 2 and started making its way through the ring yard. The ship was moved over to High Bay and then taken inside. Once inside, the ship was parked in the front left corner of the building. While Ship 29 was making its way to High Bay, down at the launch site, we could hear the clamps being retracted on the orbital launch mount. In the afternoon, a recently delivered electrical cabinet was moved into one of the prefabricated huts in front of the horizontal tanks at the orbital tank farm with some assistance from a telehandler. With Ship 29 now moved out of Mega Bay 2, crews were quick to take advantage of the extra space inside the building and lifted a catwalk for installation on one of those walls. That evening, the 2-point lifter was once again placed onto the stand in Mega Bay 2. In relatively short order, the lifter was disconnected from the bridge crane and moved out of the building before eventually being parked next to the high bay. In the pre-dawn hours of Monday morning, we could once again hear SpaceX performing a retraction test of the clamps on the orbital launch mount. Later that morning, a worker was spotted with his head inside of one of the latest Starbase mystery objects at the Sanchez site. We want to know what you think this hardware is for. Let the speculation begin in the comments below. Meanwhile, down at the launch site, the road was closed and the pad was cleared as SpaceX prepared for a fresh round of testing. The test stand tank farm was spooled up and propellants were loaded into Ship 28. Then, once everything was ready, Ship 28 performed a spin prime test of all of its 6 engines with a staggered start between the vacuum and sea-level Raptors. While testing Ship 28, SpaceX took advantage of the closure by testing the orbital tank farm at the same time. Following 2 aborted wet dress rehearsals in recent weeks, it seems that SpaceX is still working out some kinks, likely due to all of the upgrades. While the testing was going on, a flatbed was spotted with a delivery of booster engine compartment dividers. This hardware is built of stainless steel panels with corrugated steel between and are installed between the booster's outer Raptors to help protect the engines in case the adjacent Raptor were to explode. That evening, 2 SPMTs with counterweights and ship transport connectors were relocated to the launch site. This was a sign that Ship 28's testing went well and SpaceX was preparing to remove the ship from the test stand once again. A short time later, crews went up on lifts to secure the flaps on Ship 28, further evidence that the ship's latest round of testing was complete. Testing morning was again business as usual at the site of SpaceX's future 5-story office building. The concrete pump truck was once again hard at work, preparing the substantial foundations for the latest addition to Starbase. Next door, new cladding continues to be added to the Starfactory front wall, while the frontmost bay of the building continues to grow towards the office site. At the launch site, crews were putting the finishing touches on the protective armor layer for the water tank behind the electrical bunker at the orbital tank farm. Also on Tuesday, crews were once again spotted working in the wetlands under the supervision of Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. Cleanup from the previous launches has taken quite a while, likely in no small part because the nature of the wetlands makes working in them a challenge. With the recent news that the FAA has closed the mishap investigation into the second integrated flight test of Starship, Flight 3 is feeling closer than ever. The extensive scaffolding still installed on the ship quick disconnect arm, however, serves as a reminder that while SpaceX may be one step closer to receiving their next launch license, they're still not quite ready for the next launch. Over at the orbital tank farm, we can see the final position of the 2 smaller vertical tanks that were recently added in the space vacated by the old water tank. The recently added exoskeleton on the 2 freshly exposed tanks has now been painted to match the cryoshells they are protecting. At the base of the orbital launch tower, the new armor for Mechazilla's concrete base now appears to be complete and should do a good job of preventing any more damage like the spalling seen in the previous launches and static fires. Nearby at the new restroom building that has been added to the launch site, the building exterior is now structurally complete. Inside, we can see that workers have been staging supplies to begin outfitting the building's interior. That afternoon, the elevator floor for a third ship work stand was moved to Mega Bay 2. This new bay looks like it will be equipped with 3 work stands for ships, similar to what we see in Mega Bay 1 for the boosters. Just afterwards, the 2-point lifter stand loaded with the lifter from Mega Bay 2 was spotted rolling out of the build site and eventually making its way to the SPMT yard next to the payload processing facility. Shortly after 4 p.m., Booster 10's transport stand was moved out of the ring yard and into Mega Bay 1 as SpaceX prepared to move Booster 10 back off of the work stand once again. Tuesday night, SpaceX performed a test of the Raptor booster quick disconnects on the orbital launch mount. This is the first test of these QDs we've seen recently and is hopefully a sign that SpaceX is nearing launch readiness with Stage 0. A short time later, the door of Mega Bay 1 was opening, showing us that the booster had been transferred onto the awaiting transport stand and was again ready for rollout to the launch site. Back at the launch site, the LR-11000 was moved back over to Test Stand B as SpaceX moves one step closer to removing Ship 28 from the test stand following its spin prime. Then early on Wednesday, as the 5 a.m. intermittent rollout closure approached, Booster 10 once again made its way out of Mega Bay 1. The booster was moved towards Highway 4, and then as the closure window opened, officially began its latest journey to the launch site. Booster 10 rolled down Highway 4 on a journey that it feels like it should be used to by now. As the booster was moving down the road, the chopsticks were raised partially up the tower into the booster lift staging position. Then, shortly before 6 in the morning, the Flight 3 booster once again arrived at the launch site. Once there, it made its way over to the orbital launch mount and was maneuvered between the chopsticks. As the booster was being positioned between the chopsticks, the LR-11000 was picking up the 2-point lifter in anticipation of removing Ship 28 from the test stand. Next, a pair of SPMTs maneuvered Ship 28's transport stand back over near Test Stand B so it'd be ready to receive the freshly tested ship. Then the lifter was raised up to the top of Ship 28. Workers in lifts met the jig up near the shift's lifting points and guided the pins into place as the crane was secured to the ship ahead of its lift. Just a bit after 10 a.m. local time, the chopsticks were raised up to the booster's hardpoints. Once the chopsticks were in position, the ship quick disconnect arm was swung out away from the tower. Then Mechazilla's lower stabilizer arms were moved in and attached to the booster's lower stabilization points as SpaceX finalized preparations for the lift. Finally, with everything ready, Mechazilla took the weight of the booster and lifted it free off of its transport stand. The rocket was then raised up and rotated over before finally being set down on the orbital launch mount once again. While everybody was busy watching Booster 10 being lifted to the launch mount, the 5th section of Booster 14's liquid oxygen tank was moved out of the staging spot and into Mega Bay 1 for stacking. Around that same time, a concrete pump truck was once again spotted extending its boom and setting to work placing the foundations for the new office building. Back at the launch site, as Booster 10 was being set down on the launch mount, Ship 28 was being lifted off of Test Stand B. The crane then swung the ship around and slowly lowered it onto the awaiting stand, where crews quickly worked to secure it. In Mega Bay 1, the already stacked portion of Booster 14's liquid oxygen tank was lifted off of the turntable. In short order, the 5th section of the tank was attached to it, and they were tandem lifted back over to the turntable to be welded together. By early afternoon, Booster 10 was securely clamped to the orbital launch mount. At that point, the chopsticks released the Super Heavy and were lowered back to the base of the tower where the ship lifting pins were deployed. Up the road at the SPMT yard, the 2-point lifter from Mega Bay 2 was lifted off of the stand and laid nearby on the ground. With the stand now empty, it was picked up by an SPMT and rolled out of the storage yard and taken down Highway 4 to the launch site. With tower stacking operations finished for the time being, the ship quick disconnect arm was rotated back to its resting position tight to the tower. Up the road at the Sanchez site, crews continue to work on the prefabrication of the 8th section of the next orbital launch tower. With much of the segment's structure complete, we can now see the prefabricated flooring panels have been staged on the upper level for installation. Nearby, the mystery object that we saw being worked on the day before has now been painted white. Across Remedios Avenue, crews continue to work placing structural piles in preparation for the construction of SpaceX's new parking garage. Mid-afternoon, the first barrel section of Booster 14's methane tank emerged from the Starfactory and was moved over to the staging area next to Mega Bay 1. A while later, load testing was seen of the elevator floor of the middle ship work stand in Mega Bay 2. Counterweights had been loaded onto the floor, then raised and lowered, simulating Raptor installation and removal from a ship. Down at the launch site, one of the recently delivered horizontal tanks was moved from where it was offloaded and driven down Highway 4 to the D4 gate to be taken around to the back of the tank farm for installation. With Booster 10 now secure on the orbital launch mount, its transport stand was moved away from the base of the launch tower on Thursday morning, making room for Ship 28 to be staged for the next full stack. Up the road at the build site, work continued on the Starfactory expansion. New angled supports on the front, high base side of the exterior wall of the building may well indicate that it will have windows that angle up towards this corner, as was seen in the previous renders released by SpaceX. Around the same time, Ship 28 was being detached from the two-point lifter as it was now secured to its transport stand. A short time later, the door of the Starfactory opened and the second barrel section of Booster 14's methane tank was rolled out of the building. SpaceX has been making rapid progress with stacking operations on this latest Super Heavy, which now seems much more important given that they have supposedly requested to launch Starship as many as 9 times in 2024. In Mega Bay 2, the counterweights were seen being removed from the middle ship work stand. We can also see that the frames for the doors around the stand have been installed in recent days. Meanwhile, the second barrel section of Booster 14's methane tank was moved through the ring yard towards Mega Bay 1. As it approached the building, the first barrel section was shifted over in front of the door, making room for the next section to be moved to the staging area. Back at the launch complex, Ship 28 was relocated to the orbital launch mount. Once it arrived, the ship was maneuvered in between the chopsticks as SpaceX worked to prepare for yet another full stack of the Flight 3 vehicles. With Ship 28 now at the orbital pad, the LR-11000 moved the two-point lifter over to the recently arrived stand and lowered it into place before eventually being disconnected. Thursday afternoon, the SPMTs that transported Booster 10 on Wednesday morning were spotted leaving the launch site. The transporters were then making their way up Highway 4 and entered the build site, where they were parked against the fence around the Starfactory construction site. At Sanchez, the prefabricated flooring sections we saw staged the day before were now installed as the launch tower segments get one step closer to completion. As SpaceX prepared for the next full stack, the transporter stand for the launch mount work platform was moved over to the launch mount, indicating it will likely soon be removed from the underside of the OLM. With the latest lift of Ship 28 drawing nearer, the aft and forward flaps were deployed. The chopsticks were then raised up to the level of the ship lifting points and held there. As Thursday evening turned to night, Ship 29 emerged from its short stay back in High Bay. Once preparations were finished, the ship was rolled onto Highway 4 and began its trip to the launch site. Having undergone its initial cryogenic testing at the Massey's outpost and then being outfitted with engines in Mega Bay 2, this next Starship was making its first trip to the launch site and should be ready for its engine testing campaign. Switching over to Florida on Friday morning, Just Read the Instructions was towed back into Port Canaveral with Falcon 9 Booster 1067 from its recent launch. The next morning, the booster was lifted off the drone ship and transferred to the dockside stand for processing. On Sunday afternoon, the drone ship once again was towed out to sea and made its way downrange in support of the Starlink Group 6-40 launch. About an hour and a half later, Falcon 9 Booster 1069 lifted off for the 13th time as Starlink Group 6-39 was launched from Space Launch Complex 40. A few hours later, the brand new Falcon 9 Booster 1083 was rolled out to the pad with Crew Dragon Endeavour as SpaceX and NASA prepare for the upcoming launch of Crew 8 mission. In the early hours of Monday morning, crews were observed removing one of the leg struts from Booster 1067 after there seemed to be an issue stowing the leg for transport. A A short time later, the Crew 8 Falcon 9 launch stack was raised vertical at Historic Launch Complex 39A in preparation of the vehicle's pre-launch static fire test. That afternoon, with all the legs finally stowed, Booster 1067 was lifted off of the dockside stand and transferred to the horizontal transporter for its return to Roberts Road. Early on Tuesday morning, Falcon 9 Booster 1083 breathed fire for the first time on a launch pad as SpaceX performed a static fire of the new Crew 8 rocket. That afternoon, Bob was spotted heading out of Port Canaveral and out to sea in support of fairing recovery for Starlink Group 6-40 launch. Wednesday morning, Doug returned to Port Canaveral with not only the fairing halves from the previous Starlink launch, but also towing a short fall of Gravitas and Booster 1069 from that same mission. Just a few hours later, Booster 1069 was lifted off of the drone ship and placed onto the dockside stand to be prepared for its return to SpaceX's refurbishment facilities. By that next afternoon, it was back to work as Doug towed a short fall of Gravitas back out to sea in support of Starlink Group 6-41 mission. And there you have it, another SpaceX and Starbase weekly update brought to you by LabPadre. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button if you haven't already, and we'll see you next week. Thanks for watching, everyone. LabPadre out.